Good evening, everybody. It's a great privilege to have been granted the CSAR award earlier this year, and to be invited back here today by the Society and also the Master Churchill College to give some sort of insight into the research that I'm doing and the application of that research in real world terms, but also to sort of contextualize, if you like, some of the issues that I have encountered whilst conducting this research. So Sandbach Tinne won't mean a lot to many of you. It was the name of a corporation that has slipped into historical kind of obscurity, having wound up in 1975, but it had its origins in the slave trade, founded initially in Grenada in the 1780s, and then after a slave uprising in Grenada called Phaedon's Rebellion in 1795, they escaped and moved to Demerara in what became British Guyana, where they started to import enslaved Africans on an industrial scale and producing sugar at such a proportion that they managed to basically remodel the city of Liverpool with the proceeds. And they made so much money that they actually formed a bank called the Bank of Liverpool, which went on to become, as some of the older people in the room might remember, Martin's Bank. Yeah, so Martin's Bank was founded by Sir Thomas Gresham, namesake of Gresham College. The sign of Martin's Bank was the cricket. And that was a clearing bank in London that was founded during the time of Elizabeth I. This Bank of Liverpool was formed in 1831 by a man called Samuel Sandbach, namesake of Sandbach Tinne & Co. And this guy bought up Martin's Bank and 69 other banks to become the 6th largest bank in the UK, known as Bank of Liverpool Martin's Bank Limited, which then shortened its name to Martin's Bank, and in 1969 sold out to Barclays. At the time, it had 600 branches in the UK and over 3,000 employees, and as I say, was the 6th largest bank in the UK. Much of the proceeds of the asset base of that bank was from Demerara sugar. The image I've chosen to use here today is a really profound image. This is an image of a slave owner punishing one of his enslaved Africans by dipping him in the vat with the boiling sugar solution to strip the skin off his bones. And then he tells him underneath that when he gets out, he'll be giving him a nice curry coat, which meant that he would be putting spices on his molten flesh in order to continue the pain long after he came out of his punishment bath in this sugar solution. And this was a cartoon that was in the British newspapers in the 1700s and was typical of the depictions from the Caribbean in terms of how the African enslaved population were treated by the white Europeans who enslaved them there. So this is a very difficult kind of thing to come to terms with, and we don't see a lot of this in British history. It's not taught on the national curriculum. It doesn't occur within the public discourse in the case of most of us, except those who are particularly interested in the history. But this is from a picture which is actually hanging in the National Portrait Gallery. And the reason I chose this image was really to show the barbarity and the brutality of colonialism at its peak. That which has been depicted as the greatness, if you like, of the British Empire, that this is what it meant to the people who fueled that empire with their free labor over a period of 300 to 400 years, and allowed people like Samuel Sandbach to profit from it. Okay, this is where the technical stuff goes all wrong. This is supposed to work. Is there a way to... I think the battery's run out. Sorry about this. Can I get some technical support and I'll keep talking? I need to flip to the slides. Unless you can control the slides from up there, you can give me another slide, please. You able to do that? Oh, hang on, I've got it. Here we go. So what I decided to do was really to understand this historical context. And I uncovered this company quite by chance because my father was born in 1918. It's fine, it works now. My father was born in 1918 in what was then British Guyana. He was a colonial merchant seaman, came to the UK in 1936. He was on the supply ships during the start of World War II. And in 1942, he volunteered for national service to fight the Nazis, and then settled in Britain after the war, had his children, amongst, whom was myself in the 1960s, and then died when I was really quite young. And I was taken into local authority care at a very young age, and as a consequence of that was excluded entirely from the school system. And I was living in an area prior to being taken into care with 4 white families and 100,000 black families, and constantly being told to go back to where you came from without knowing where that was, but being made to feel like I don't belong here. So I want to find out, where do I belong? So I hearkened back to my father's homeland to really understand something about it. And in looking at his ancestry, when I started to trace it back, I went back 2 generations and I hit slavery. And I hit an individual called Andrew Watson, who was a footballer in the 19th century, who had captained the Scottish national side. His father was a slave owner. His mother had been born enslaved and manumitted when she was an infant, and she grew up as what was called a free woman of color. So this mixed race black child was sent to England at the age of 3, and then between England and Scotland was educated at the highest levels, went to King's College in London, matriculated under Lord Kelvin at Glasgow University, and everywhere he went, he played football. So he's now acknowledged as the world's first black international football captain, captaining Scotland, 6-1 defeat of England at the Oval in 1881, went to play for the London Corinthians, the Corinthian Spirit, played for Bootle FC and Liverpool, played for the London Swifts, played for Queen's Park, and a range of other teams. So this guy looked like me. He had the same family name as my father. I changed my name from Watson to Al Nasir when I became a Muslim in 1992. Prior to that, I was Mark Watson. So I'm trying to find out my connection to this guy. And I found some letters by a guy called Peter Miller Watson, who was his father. And he ran plantations in Demerara. And I wanted to understand about this plantation business and how it related to the footballer Andrew Watson, and genealogically how he was related to me. So that started me on my journey. And I created the Sandbach Tinne Project in order to do that. And I brought together all of these partner organizations that you can see here, who hosted collections relating to Sandbach Tinne. And that's everything from ephemera to marble reliefs to physical artifacts such as paintings, oil paintings, and some of this stuff was in storage. Nobody had really heard of these guys. The collections were there, but nobody had really put the pieces together. So I said, well, let me look at this family through a genealogical lens and see what emerges. And not only did I find that they owned plantations, but they also owned this bank. They were the founders of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. Amongst this family was a prime minister, William Ewart Gladstone. His father, John Gladstone, had plantations in Demerara. He had over 4,000 slaves between his plantations in Demerara and Jamaica. And his wife, the mother of Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, was the 3rd cousin to Samuel Sandbach's wife. So they were both operating in Guyana. They were both at a senior level. They were both running things in Liverpool. Samuel Sandbach was a mayor of Liverpool at one point in 1830 to 1831, the year he formed the bank. And they were making fortunes, and they were the architects of the city. They built the suburb of Aigburth. That was Samuel Sandbach's land, subdivided. I now live in Aigburth, okay? They built the suburb of Everton, which was a rich merchant community, a gated community, high up on the hill where you could see your ships coming over the bar before they ever arrived in port. After the potato famine and the poor Irish people moved in, all the merchants moved out of Everton and kind of decanted to Aigburth. But they built the city. When the Liverpool-Manchester Railway was formed, it was John Gladstone at the helm. He issued the actual prospectus for people to invest in the establishment of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, because he was sick of moving his slave-produced products up and down the canal at 2 miles an hour. And some guy, Stevenson, had invented this engine thing over in Newcastle, and he thought it'd be a good idea to bring that to Liverpool. And the trials of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway, it was Philip Frederick Tinne, namesake of Sandbach Tinne, who paid for the survey for the line for the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. And these guys went on to build the railways right across the empire. Now, we know about the Liverpool-Manchester Railway. We know about William Ewart Gladstone. We know about John Gladstone. But we didn't know this interrelationship, the prosopography that I have applied to this research that has given us the kind of ontology of how these guys interacted with one another is what has uniquely given us an opportunity to be able to rethink and reimagine, if you like, these histories based on the familial connectedness of these individuals. It wasn't just about the things that individuals did. It was about what they were doing as a family, because they were all doing business with one another on a very incestuous kind of basis. So I found collections in all of these places, and we've just submitted a £10 million bid to the Leverhulme Trust for an establishment of a colonial research centre, which would be situated at University of Liverpool, and also in partnership with Cambridge Digital Humanities and Cambridge Library. We've been shortlisted down to 12 for 3 centres, so we've got a good chance, I would hope by December, that we'll get a final notification as to whether or not the centre is going to be funded. If it is funded, Liverpool University have agreed to put £3.5 million of additional funding, and I've been developing this whilst I've been doing my PhD here. So just to get a bit of context of who they were, this was something that was produced in about 1902 of the Sandbach Tinne family. So the various different characters are within this family tree, and at the bottom you've got this kind of piracy. As people will know, if anyone's done history, the difference between a pirate and a privateer was a letter of marque. You know, if you had this letter of marque, you could officially steal people's stuff. If you didn't have it, you were a pirate and you were hung at the yardarm or whatever. They engaged in both. They had letters of marque, but they were also pirates. And what's interesting about this family was that they had doctors of divinity, people writing books on ecclesiastical jurisprudence. They were building churches. A couple of them were canonized, but their principal business was slavery. So some of the things that they were involved in: plantation slavery. They had their own shipping lines. Gladstone had a shipping line. Sandbach Tinne had a shipping line. Railways: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, America, Guyana, Britain. They were building railways across that. Banking, they had multiple banks. It wasn't just Bank of Liverpool. They had the Bank of North and South Wales as well, that were minting currency in Wales. Insurance companies: Caledonia Insurance became Guardian Assurance, became AXA. Politics and civil office, obviously they had a civic office. They had William Ewart Gladstone was a prime minister. John Gladstone was an MP. There were Tinne MPs. There were Sandbach MPs. Some of you might know that I recently mentioned about one of the Sandbach MPs and her collection to this guy, and she threatened to sue me and Cambridge University. It was all over the news, like, you know, Antoinette Sandbach threatens to sue Cambridge University because of being mentioned in my research. But they've had politicians through the family and this kind of parliamentary privilege that's passed on through generations. They were commodities brokers. If you owed them money, which many people did because they were a bank, you had to ship your commodities through their shipping lines. So they were making money from all sorts of areas, but they were also heavily involved in the development of industrial technology. When steam came out, they developed some of the earliest steam engines to pull cane, which later was sort of translated, if you like, into what we know as steam trains and also steamships. And they were among the first people to ever put a steam engine on a ship. Some of you might have heard of the explorer Alexine Tinne, who was murdered in the Sudan. It was her work that was followed by Dr. Livingstone. She actually went further down the Nile than Burton and Speke. And she was she had a mechanized boat that had it was a yacht that had a steam engine on that was financed by Sandbach Tinne. It was the first ever yacht to have a steam engine. So slavery compensation, people know that in 1833 the Emancipation Act was passed, and in 1837 compensation was paid to the slave owners for the loss of their slaves. It was £20 million. It was the biggest, and still to date, the largest quantitative easing that had ever taken place in Britain. It was 40% of the British GDP at that time that was injected cash into the economy. The slaves got zero, not one penny for having been enslaved, but the slave traders lost their labor, their free labor, so they got compensated. John Gladstone was the single biggest recipient. John Abram Tinne of Sandbach Tinne was the second biggest recipient. Then they switched their ships to India and got into indentured labor. So John Gladstone decided to repurpose his slave ships to bring what they called at the time, and it's a derogatory term, coolie labor from Shanghai and Calcutta. And they populated the plantations that no longer had enslaved labor with indentured laborers and changed permanently the demographics of the Americas. So many people will see in America the stories of the Chinese laborers who built the railways out there that were owned by John Gladstone and others. And they were being shipped in primarily by Gladstone and Sandbach Tinne. In fact, they were actually known in the early stages as Gladstone's coolies. Apprenticeship, they managed to negotiate when slavery was finished that they would apprentice the enslaved people for 4 years. So in other words, you're free, congratulations, but you can't leave. You have to work as an apprentice to learn a proper trade for free with me for the next 4 years before you can be emancipated. So it was this in-between status where you were neither free nor, you couldn't be sold, but you could be worked for free even after you were supposedly emancipated and after the slave traders had had their compensation. And then there was colonial rule. These guys were involved heavily in the British Raj. They were involved in, one of them was Governor General of Australia. There was a whole range of different things they were involved in. They got involved in botany. They were sending rare plants from the Caribbean back to the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. They were sending stuff off to the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. They created the Botanic Gardens in Liverpool. And as a consequence of all of this, institutes of learning came about, like the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, the London School of Tropical Medicine, which they were also heavily involved in, and they were well represented in the military and also in the media. They created the world's first press office, which was known as the Liverpool News Exchange. Thanks to the award that I received from CSAR, I was able to finance a trip to Guyana this year. I'm a fourth-year PhD now, just finishing up, writing up. I wasn't able to do a field trip in my second year because of the pandemic, but I wanted to go out and find out a little bit more whilst I was out there. This is the Blairmont Sugar Refinery, where my father in the 1930s actually cooked cane barefoot in those fields with snakes. Going to that place and seeing where slaves had cooked cane, where my own father had cooked cane, was quite visceral for me. I met with the plantation manager, and they gave me a tour of the sugar production facility and also the plantations. They showed me some of the artifacts and also gave me some old maps, which I couldn't find anywhere else. I managed to find out some really interesting things from what they supplied me with. One, that there was 4 plots of land that are still registered to my father, which nobody's claimed. I managed to get the what's called the transfers for those lands. I was able to see on the maps from Blairmont that the land that was given to my grandfather, which was passed down to my father, was actually within the Blairmont estate, which was previously owned by Sandbach Tinne, which gave me a direct connection to Sandbach Tinne and the fact that someone in Sandbach Tinne family had black children with enslaved people and had passed them some land, which came down to my grandfather, which was passed on to my father, which he never claimed. This gave me confirmation of my connection to Sandbach Tinne, and it gave me also an opportunity to trace these hereditary kind of land grants that were made, because they wouldn't just give a black person a piece of land. They exploited black people. They were not interested in giving them anything unless they were a member of their family, which many of them were, primarily due to the sexual exploitation of the enslaved Africans on the plantation. Just finally, what I also realized was that although enslaved people were banned from having any kind of religious practice, regardless of what religion they had when they left Africa, they were not allowed to have Christianity because it was considered that they would then have human aspirations. And it was only after the uprising in Demerara of 1823, which nearly wiped out the white population when over 3,000 enslaved Africans rose up. And they basically feared for their existence. And they said, well, we can't continue as a minority, even with guns, to hold this many people enslaved. We have to find another way to control them. And the Reverend John Smith, who was a missionary, had been out there proselytizing. Previously, he'd been sort of, abused by a lot of the planters for teaching slaves to read, because if they could then read English, they could read the newspapers, then they'd know the movements of the whites, and then they could potentially rise up. We didn't want any of that. So what they decided to do was blame him for the uprising. If he hadn't taught them to read, they wouldn't have had these human aspirations. They would have continued to be quite happy to be categorized as property, not people, and they wouldn't have been able to know our movements because they wouldn't have been able to read the newspapers. But the testimony of John Smith to a parliamentary inquiry in the wake of this was basically a litany of everything that was wrong with slavery as an institution, and every right that the enslaved people should have to hear the Gospels, as it were. And it was only after that that people thought, well, we can't not give them Christianity, so let's give them a version where we can continue to control them afterwards. And the only way we can do that is if we give them a version of the Bible, which is not the full version. So they gave them the Slave Bible, which had only about 200 of the 1,000 and something books that come in the Bible, removed all the bits about the Old Testament, and particularly about Moses and the slaves being freed from Egypt. All of that was removed from it. And then they gave them a new version of Christianity, encouraged them to baptize their slaves. So what I found when I was over there on this trip, which I wouldn't have been able to do without the CSAR award, was these baptismal records. And you can see on these records here that, for instance, you would have the name of the child, and then the parents' names and surnames, and then the abode and the profession of the parents. But in the case of this one here, where you see, I think this is infant slaves, it's got a list of half a dozen or so, and then it's got property of and the name of the owner. So there's no parents, there's no date of birth, there's nothing like that. And then you'll have again, here belonging to. And then you've got, the name of whoever they belong to. I think in one of them, I think it says, one of the ones that I've got, it's also got government as the owner. So what you had here was the complicity of the church in maintaining this kind of apartheid system within the religion, which encouraged not only a different categorization for, the sort of white Christians to the black Christians, but also a system whereby their humanity was not to be recorded in the same way. So that is what I found. I wanted to thank very much CSAR for facilitating my trip to Guyana by providing the funds through the award. And I hope that my work has been illuminating. I'm sure it's challenging for a number of you to deal with, but I'm more than happy to take questions if anybody's interested in doing that.
Why not? I just reached out my phone. Malik, thank you. That was a very powerful presentation, and I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of reflection on what you've just said. I know, speaking to you in the summer, that what hit me very directly was how much of this stuff is documented, and you've been finding it, and that business of unearthing what is there and making sure that it's recorded, it seems to be such a, well, it is such an important task. And that's what came across to me as the significance of quite a lot of your PhD.
Yeah, I think the difficulty has been trying to uncover the documents within the archives where they've never been considered to be a priority. This is an aspect of British history that does not get taught in schools, mostly. It's optional on the national curriculum to teach about slavery. It's a dark part in the history that people would just rather everyone forget about. That's in the past, let's just get over it. But what I came to understand, for instance, with these people, when I looked into the archives, I found, for instance, the foundations of the Liverpool Royal Institution by Thomas Stuart Trail. The beginnings of what is today the national curriculum is being really drafted by this guy, and he's entirely funded by slave traders. So you've got a rationale, if you like, for the foundations of the modern education system, which has been crafted by these individuals. And that's why it's important for us to be able to understand where structural racism as it stands today comes from. So it's not just a thing of the past, but you won't get that unless you look at the historical context within which it occurred.
So welcome questions.
Could I ask if you've had full access to the files held at Hanslope Park?
No, I've been focused primarily on my own archive. The archive that I have of Sandbach Tinne, I purchased on the open market, and I did so because I found it really difficult to get archival access to, you know, in the National Archives. And those kind of places. You get like a day pass in the British Library. You know, you can't see much in a day. You go to other places, you get an hour slot. You know, it's old handwriting, it's difficult, dusty documents, it's very hard to read. So I just felt like, because of the fact that they're not a collecting priority for a lot of places, the places that do have them, in many cases, they're not indexed and catalogued. And they're certainly not promoted because there's not considered to be a demand. If I was talking about something like William Wilberforce and abolition, that's very sexy. There'd be loads of access to loads of stuff. There's all kinds of digitized stuff. But with this stuff, it's just really, it just, at the time when I started my research, it wasn't readily available.
Well, I think it has been for lawsuits about 10 years ago, relating to a group of Kenyans who claimed that they'd been tortured by
Are you talking about the Mau Maus?
Yes.
They brought a legal case.
Yes, they did.
Won the legal case.
The trail led to the MI6 base at Hanslope Park. I'll tell you about it afterwards.
Okay, I do remember the case when it came into the public domain. It's not my area and it's not my period, because it was, I think, 1940s, 1950s, perhaps, when they were wrapping them in barbed wire and castrating them and things like that.
It might have been more general than that, because what the council said was that it was the main repository for all British private and public papers on the subject of slavery.
That I did not know, well, and I'd be very interested to find out about that.
Let's pick that up later.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I pick up any other questions? Yes.
Truly shocking and surprising. But it's based on your own family history.
Yes, absolutely.
And around Liverpool. Have you any idea just how widespread this is? How many other families, how many other large cities would have secrets of this nature still buried?
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example, we looked at some connections in Bristol, for instance, and the Company of Merchant Venturers and so on. You've seen, obviously, what happened with the Colston statue with Edward Colston. There was historical narrative which said that there was not a brick in Bristol that was not drenched in the blood of a slave. And this is stuff from the time, you know. When you look at places like Lancaster, which you'd never really think of Lancaster, but Lancaster were building the slave ships on a massive scale. When you think of Glasgow and the tobacco industry in Glasgow, the tobacco industry in Glasgow was all, you know, slave-produced produce. Places that you wouldn't think about, like Inverness. Inverness was producing the sackcloth that was being used for the clothes for enslaved people. It was the coffee sacks.
So this is the jute business, was it?
You mean are you talking about the island or the tribe?
No, the fabric,
it's yes.
Dundee was the great place for the jute industry, wasn't it?
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure about what was going on in Dundee, but certainly in Inverness, they used to ship the slave clothes, like what they call slave hats and slave clothes. They would ship them out en masse from there, but they were using the same material for the clothes for the enslaved Africans that they were using as the sackcloth for the coffee. So it was, you know, they were considered, it was very coarse and very, you know, terrible. But also things like Newfoundland, the majority of the enslaved population of Guyana were fed, the protein elements of their diet was saltfish from either Scotland or Newfoundland. And that has left a legacy, if you like, among the population of Guyana between the sugar and the salt. of hypertension and diabetes, which is disproportionate. And many of the medicines which are being created for diabetes and hypertension and being tested on African populations have a far less efficacy on Caribbean populations because their whole metabolisms have changed because of being force fed with saltfish and sugar, because their foods that they were producing were cash crops that were being exported and they weren't allowed to eat them. So there's a lot of these sorts of legacies in places that you wouldn't think. And that's why it's important to have a prosopographical approach to it, where you start looking at the families, the family connections, and you start seeing that they had different places where they did different things, which all collectively contributed to this machine, this colonial machine. And the ontology of that network is where the truth lies. But we don't see that because we think in the historiography of a period, or we think of an event, or a particular person, and we don't look at it necessarily in the context of these families. A different history emerges when you take that prosopographical approach, and that's the approach that I've taken.
I think we probably need to move on, but Malik, thank you. It's
Thank you so much.
Very powerful